Miguel Rubio grew up working the land on his family's farm in Mexico. Their parcel of land was small, and they didn't have much money, but they had enough to eat and maintain a humble lifestyle. Ever since he was a kid, he'd heard of people going north to work in the United States. As time passed, he began to notice something.
Y decían muchos, llegaban allá con el pantalón Levi, tejana y camisa vaquera. Y bueno, señores, les va bien vestidos.
People were coming back to Mexico from the United States wearing Levi's and nice cowboy shirts. They seem to be doing pretty well for themselves.
Pues antes era uno porque pues ya llegó aquel desde Estados Unidos, ya llegó aquel, gente pues desconocida, conocida.
More and more. Oh, look, this guy's going. That guy's going. People we knew, people we didn't know.
Y pues uno de familia pobre, voy a buscar, a ver si es posible.
Rubio wanted to go in search of that life too. So, he did. Those guys he saw returning to his hometown in Levi's and nice shirts, the United States called them Braceros, from the Spanish word for arm, brazo. These men who worked with their arms were part of a government-sponsored program that, starting in the 1940s, brought Mexican workers to the U.S. to help farms and railroad companies across the country.
From Belgrade, Florida, to Seattle, Washington, from San Diego to Boston, and all places in between.
The Bracero Program began at a time when the U.S. agricultural industry was facing dire labor shortages during World War II. It continued well past the war years until 1964, and over that time, it brought over 4 million Mexican men to the U.S. as workers. About 15,000 of those men worked in Oregon while the program lasted here from 1943 to 1947.
Historians have done a very poor job acknowledging the contribution of this generation of men to the war economy of the United States.
From the Gert Boyle Studio, I'm Jen Chavez, and this is The Evergreen, a podcast from OPB about the place you call home. And today, we are acknowledging the contributions of braceros in the Pacific Northwest. They harvested apples in the Yakima Valley, hops in the Willamette Valley, potatoes in Klamath County, and sugar beets in eastern Oregon and Idaho. These workers endured widespread labor abuses, workplace injuries, and anti-Mexican racism, problems that still exist for some farm workers in the U.S. today. The Braceros helped save American agriculture during World War II, and later built Mexican-American communities in Oregon that are thriving to this day. Dr. Erasmo Gamboa is a historian with the University of Washington who's written extensively about the Bracero Program in the Pacific Northwest.
They come at a time when the nation needs Mexico's help. And I like to believe that in many parts of the country, parts of Oregon, these men made the difference between harvested and perished crops.
The United States' entry into World War II presented a challenge to American farmers. They would need to feed and clothe not only a nation at war, but also millions of Allied troops and European civilians. They had a few things on their side. Many federal irrigation projects begun in the 30s had now been completed, and new rural electrification projects provided a power source, allowing for once desert land to be converted into farmland. But the missing piece was workers. Not only were tens of thousands of American farm workers joining or being drafted into the military, but others were heading from rural areas to bigger cities in search of wartime industry jobs that often paid better. Think the World War II-era shipyards in Portland, for example. The labor shortage was a real problem that threatened crops, and farm owners tried a lot of different sources to plug the gap.
They tried to meet the labor shortage by appealing to what was called at the time domestic labor. And that includes all unemployed women, school children, prisoners of war, Japanese intern labor.
Quick pause. Yep, Japanese Americans incarcerated in prison camps by the government during the war were expected to do farm labor there. For example, at the notorious Tule Lake camp in Northern California, over 1,000 Japanese Americans did farm work for $12 a month, a quarter of what farm workers were usually paid, under threat of fine if they didn't participate. Some of the people incarcerated there actually owned their own farms elsewhere, like in Oregon's Hood River Valley. But all of that wasn't enough labor to meet the need. So,
at the very end, they turned to Mexico.
The governments of the United States and Mexico made an agreement allowing Mexican men to work in states across the U.S. on temporary contracts and then return to Mexico. The program would be administered by the U.S. Department of Labor.
This is probably the first big influx of Mexican origin people coming to the state of Oregon, the Bracero Program.
But let's rewind real quick because this wasn't the beginning of the presence of Mexican workers in Oregon. After all, don't forget that before 1848, Mexico itself was much closer by. My home state, California, was still Mexico until then.
The fact that what we call Oregon now was contiguous with what was Mexico for a very long time is really important. Folks with Mexican origins, of course, were moving up and down the West Coast through California into what is now Oregon, what is now Washington.
Dr. Lynn Stephen is a Philip H. Knight Chair and professor of anthropology at the University of Oregon. She said some of the early Mexican workers in Oregon included mule packers who assisted white settler militias during the Rogue River War in the 1850s, and vaqueros, a word later anglicized to buckaroos, Mexican cowboys hired by ranchers to herd cattle as they moved north into southeastern Oregon.
There's a very old Mexican presence in sort of the eastern central part of Oregon. And that dates back to the 19th century, the 1800s.
Gamboa pointed to Nissa in eastern Oregon as a place where there had been a stream of agricultural migrants coming up from the southwest, which included some Mexican workers. Also, the Bracero Program of the 40s wasn't the first time that the United States had set up a Mexican guest worker program.
World War II is the third of the Bracero programs, in my opinion. The first one is negotiated between President Taft and President Diaz of Mexico when they meet in El Paso, Texas in 1909. And that allows for the contracting of Mexican labor to different parts of the nation, including the Pacific Northwest. That will continue. And then during the First World War, looming labor shortages creates a more sophisticated Bracero program, which is the second one.
After the First World War ended, the American government was obligated to return workers to Mexico, but in many parts of the country they were abandoned instead. Then the Depression started. A labor shortage became a job shortage, and Mexican workers were scapegoated. In general, anti-immigrant sentiment was on the rise. Before long, hundreds of thousands of Mexicans, far more than participated in the World War I program, were repatriated or deported.
It is truly astonishing that Mexico would agree to the Bracero program in 1941-42, when just earlier during the 1930s, close to 500,000 Mexican people are repatriated back to Mexico. Half of them American citizens, with no due process of law. In many cases, just swept off the streets.
But they did agree. And the U.S. once again wanted help. The new Bracero program, officially called the Emergency Farm Labor Supply Program, sought not only to attract Mexican workers, but to control immigration. To that effect, the governments built in safeguards.
10% of the wages of these workers, once they're employed in the United States, will be withheld from them and returned to them only and if they return to Mexico.
Before we continue, I should say that many workers who returned to Mexico never got the 10% of their wages that were withheld. Millions of dollars just disappeared. In 2008, the Mexican government agreed to a class action settlement of over $14 million to compensate World War II-era braceros living in the U.S. for those lost wages. But years later, tens of thousands of elderly former braceros were still waiting to be paid. At the time, the government also photographed the workers to keep track of them, and railroad companies that used the program had to put up a $500 bond repayable to them when they proved they'd returned workers to Mexico.
And this was a way of managing these labor flows across the two countries.
The Mexican government put out newspaper ads to attract rural workers into the cities to sign up for the program. Mexico City was the first to open a recruiting and processing center in 1942. Tens of thousands of people showed up, far more than could be contracted.
The selection process is going to ensure that there are going to be young, able-bodied men sort of in the prime of their lives. There were a lot of men who actually had some level of education, and they are rejected.
Former bracero Miguel Rubio went through one of these centers in the years after the war.
Cuando pasaba uno la contratación, exigía que tuvieran las manos como callos. La gente que tenía las manos lisas no le daban trabajo, porque decían, tú no eres campesino, ¿verdad?
He remembered that they asked to see if the men's hands were calloused. If they had soft hands, they wouldn't get a contract. You're not a farmer, they'd say. Those chosen would move on to another selection center along the U.S.-Mexico border.
And there, U.S. authorities will look them over again, inspect them for their physical ability, feel their biceps, their muscles. They will give them tests for venereal disease, for syphilis. They will prick the skin for tuberculosis.
They were also exposed to a toxic pesticide, as another former bracero, Jesus Martinez, remembered.
Que nos echaron hasta DDT por todas partes, que para desinfectarnos, quién sabe que por la cabeza y todo eso, que teníamos piojos, que fue que vino.
They sprayed us with DDT in our hair all over, Martinez said. They thought we had fleas. Then employers chose who they wanted to hire, the temporary work contracts would be processed, and the men were taken by truck or train to destinations around the country. Some, like Rubio, headed for California. Others, like Martinez, to southern states. And some to Oregon.
Many of these young men had never been out of their small communities. So if they have a contract that says Yamhill, Oregon, they have no idea where Yamhill is, and certainly no idea where Oregon is, the climate, anything.
An old photograph shows some of the first braceros to come to the state, a few dozen men, arriving at a train station in Hood River, Oregon in the fall of 1943. Gamboa visited that train station and said the same sign you can see in the picture was still there.
And I stood on an adjacent hill, and I asked myself, what could they have imagined? What did they think? They must have been relieved to arrive in Hood River because it's almost a 7-day journey. Oregon obviously was very different, particularly Hood River, from much of Mexico. If they had arrived in Nisa, Oregon, maybe there was some similarity, but Hood River, very, very different.
Braceros were brought in to harvest crops like hops, potatoes, and sugar beets across the state. A newspaper clipping from the Northwest Farm News described their work in rather rosy terms. It read, "Being in the out of doors, working at top efficiency in the cool of the morning and slowing to a more languid pace as the noon sun warms the back and relaxes the spirit. There's joy in handling the ripe round fruit, either picking or packing pears, apples, and prunes." In reality, of course, the jobs were extremely difficult.
You can imagine harvesting sugar beets in close to freezing temperatures. And the men are not accustomed to this.
The Bracero program promised workers a minimum wage of 30 cents an hour, which was low by American standards. But
Era bueno, era bastante bien, porque venía a ganar un poquito más de dinero de lo que yo ganaba allá en México, ¿verdad? Yo pues era gente pobre, hijo de campesino y eso, ¿verdad? Entonces, para mí estaba bastante bien.
Miguel Rubio said he felt he made a good amount of money, more than he made in Mexico. We were poor, he said, children of farmers, so it was great for us. Workers were also promised adequate living conditions in labor camps, but that was often not the case. Plus, today's labor laws didn't really exist yet, and the language barrier caused problems.
you have a all Spanish-speaking labor force and an English-speaking employer that just complicates and makes it very difficult to properly instruct the men how to climb a tree, how to move a ladder, work around dangerous equipment. And this complicates and is the cause of many accidents. There were a lot of very serious casualties, deaths.
Still, workers got the job done. Gamboa said Northwest farmers and the general public initially saw them as a godsend.
Because the labor shortage is so severe. Farmers are having to plow their crops under. Green bean production around Independence. There's no one to pick these beans. And when the workers arrive, there's actually a kind of a celebratory mood, but it lasts maybe a year or so. And after that, it begins quickly in some place to go downhill. Idaho in particular is notorious for the discrimination against the men.
At one point, the state of Texas was banned from the program altogether because Mexican workers had been lynched there. Idaho also came close to being blacklisted. In Oregon and Washington, Mexican workers endured racist street harassment and violence.
Entonces había negocios donde decía, no se admiten negros y mexicanos. O con letreros muy claros. En inglés o en español los traducían.
Miguel Rubio said where he worked in California, there were businesses that had signs saying they didn't admit Black people or Mexicans, clear signs in English and translated to Spanish. The food at the labor camps, meanwhile, was a big point of tension. In Grants Pass, hundreds of men suffered from food poisoning in an incident in 1943. Across the state, many workers objected to the type and quality of food they were being served.
There was no one to prepare the food that these workers were accustomed to. And if you can imagine, in some of these camp facilities, there are several hundred men. They all eat at the same time. When they tried to feed them, for example, roast beef, the men would not eat it. They saw it as uncooked. They got tired of peanut butter and jelly sandwiches.
Braceros were willing to push back against inadequate food. Gamboa described an incident where braceros working on railroad tracks in Portland one day, as noon approached, ripped up the track and stopped working.
And then they decide to go on strike. And all the traffic is stopped into this critical juncture in downtown Portland. And they negotiate for better food. And they're able to get their supervisor to take them to a restaurant, and they order the food they want. And on that condition, then they go back to work. They do have agency.
Labor actions were uniquely widespread in the Pacific Northwest, where braceros staged successful work stoppages and strikes over a number of issues and poor working conditions. It's a prelude to the robust farm worker labor movement that would develop in Oregon in the second half of the century. One particularly large strike during the war saw over 1,000 braceros in Idaho stop work for 9 days in a wage dispute. In Oregon, workers fought back against insufficient wages in Medford, Klamath Falls, and elsewhere. In 1945, the majority of the state's labor camps were affected by labor unrest and stoppages.
The ability of the men to stand up for their contract and to stand up to abuse is extraordinary because they are alone. And in a sense, they're bound by this contract.
There were widespread problems and abuse within the Bracero Program. In many ways, it did not live up to the promises it made to workers. Years later, one of its former directors, Department of Labor official Lee Williams, described it as legalized slavery. But some workers remembered their experience as a bracero positively, like Jesus Martinez, who participated in the program in the 1950s.
Para mí fue una historia muy bonita porque veníamos a conocer y veníamos a trabajar. Se puede decir que nos abrieron la brecha, el camino para poder llegar a Estados Unidos.
For me, it was a really beautiful time, he said. We came to visit new places, but we also came to work. You could say they opened the door for us to come to the United States. The contributions of these Mexican workers to agriculture in the Northwest and across the country were enormous.
The men allowed the agricultural industry to pull itself out of the depths of the Depression, and it will sustain agriculture during the course of the war.
Coming up after a break, how the Bracero Program influenced Mexican migration and agricultural labor for years to come, and reshaped the Latina diaspora in the Pacific Northwest. Thanks for listening to The Evergreen, our podcast from OPB about the place you call home. If you dig what you hear, subscribe to us on your favorite podcast app, and we'll brighten your Monday morning a little bit with something new and fascinating to listen to each week. You can also follow OPB on Instagram at OPBphoto, or follow me directly at Jen Chavez OPB. That's Jen with 2 N's, and I'll keep you posted on what Team Evergreen is up to. And remember, this episode about the Bracero Program in the Northwest and all the great OPB reporting and storytelling you hear on the show is made possible by the support of many thousands of OPB members. That's right, you are the public in public media. Support our journalism by becoming an OPB sustaining member today at opb.org/pod. And now, back to the show. Remember Miguel Rubio, who we heard from at the beginning of this episode? He remembered guys in his neighborhood coming back to Mexico from working as braceros with nice clothes and money in their pockets. It inspired him to do the same, and it inspired many braceros to return to the U.S. again, like Antonio Amezcua Martinez, or to West Lynn educator Miguel Salinas, Tio Antonio.
My uncle came up in the late 40s and the early 50s. In fact, he was in St. Paul, Oregon in 1951, not working as a bracero, but actually going into the next stage of labor. He had already experienced being a bracero, and he was now looking for something better. And he came up to Oregon in 1951 and worked in St. Paul farms.
He was one of many braceros whose experience working in the U.S. motivated them to return. Dr. Erasmo Gamboa says this was encouraged by some farm owners in the Northwest. Agricultural labor is highly skilled, particularly in Oregon. The men had to be trained.
And that necessitated some investment on the part of the employer investing into this worker. And if the employer found a good worker, generally the advice was, go back to Mexico, but next year, come back. But bring your family because I want you to come back. I want you to work for me. And that kind of relationship is found in many parts of the country. They can't bring their family under the Bracero Program, but they can come back as a free wage earner. They can immigrate. And keep in mind that there's almost no restriction on Mexican immigration to the United States during the 1940s. The border is relatively open. Concurrently, there's this flow of labor outside of the Bracero Program.
In Oregon, unlike other parts of the country, the Bracero Program ended in 1947. The federal government stopped paying for the workers' travel between Mexico and the United States, causing most Oregon employers to drop out of the program.
It doesn't mean that the need for farm labor disappears. In fact, it's going to be greater. And that Bracero Program gives way to migratory labor. So I think that the importance of the Bracero Program is that it encourages a permanent reliance on Mexican labor by agricultural producers in Oregon.
Dr. Lynn Stephen from the University of Oregon said that in the years after the war, Oregon growers began recruiting Mexican Americans from other U.S. states as well as Mexican immigrants. But something else happened after the war in 1954, a government initiative that was called Operation Wetback, which is a racist slur for Mexican immigrants.
Which was an official mass deportation program under the Eisenhower administration. And actually, Mexico collaborated with this.
The U.S. government said it deported over 1 million people. Just like in the 1930s, American citizens got swept up and deported. Immigration raids happened in major cities around the country, and Stephen said many Mexicans were deported from Oregon during this time.
I find that really interesting period in U.S. history that demonstrates this both simultaneously dependence on Mexican agricultural labor, but this political ideology of, law and order and detention and deportation at exactly the same time.
Stephen said immigration reform in the 80s under President Reagan allowed farm workers without permanent legal status who'd been here for a number of years to access legal residency and citizenship. In Oregon,
about 24,000 folks, mostly from Mexico, received a green card, permanent residency, and then many of them went on to become citizens. And once they were regularized, they could petition for their spouses and even for their children.
Mexican and Latina communities continue to grow throughout the state and are growing still. Census data says nearly 15% of Oregon's population identifies as Hispanic or Latino. Meanwhile, the state's farm labor force kept growing too. All in all, U.S. Department of Agriculture data estimates there are now over 72,000 agricultural workers in Oregon. The state's farm worker labor movement has successfully pushed for protections like heat and wildfire smoke rules and overtime pay. Some of those 72,000 workers are here under a guest worker program of the modern era, the H-2A visa program, which allows agricultural employers who anticipate a shortage of domestic workers to hire temporary foreign farm workers. Stephen said the number of H-2A visa holders each year in Oregon is growing.
And the last, the government's fiscal year goes, I think, October to October in 24. There were 5,000 H-2A workers in Oregon, which is a significant increase.
It's a small share of the state's total farm workforce and is dwarfed by neighboring states California and Washington's use of H-2A workers. But as the Oregon Farm Bureau Federation's Jenny Dressler said at a recent legislative hearing related to the program, several hundred employers in Oregon hire H-2A workers.
The domestic workforce just is not available during the time that is needed. And then it's a program that provides certainty that you're going to be able to get your crop out of the ground or off the tree and get it to market while it's still marketable. And so farming is really unpredictable. We're always looking for certainty.
Some protections and benefits are written into the program, like free housing and transportation and a minimum pay rate. And to potential foreign workers, it holds similar appeal to the Bracero Program, a chance to come to the U.S. legally and return with more money than you could have made at home. But just like with the Bracero Program before it, how things look on paper isn't always how they are in practice. The Department of Labor's Wage and Hours Division investigates H-2A employers for possible violations of the program's rules. Nationally, from fiscal years 2018 through 2023, they found one or more violations in almost 2,400 of their investigations, many related to wages. These violations affected over 66,000 workers.
The H-2A program creates a large power imbalance between employers and foreign workers on temporary visas that only allow them to work for one employer, and this dependency on a single employer creates a vulnerable workforce and opportunities for exploitation, including labor trafficking. In some cases, there are abuses of illegal recruitment fees, recruitment fraud, unsanitary housing conditions, and even immigration threats.
That's Ira Cuello Martinez with the Woodburn farmworker advocacy group Pineros y Campesinos Unidos del Noroeste, or PCUN. Plus, as U of O's Lynn Stephen pointed out, how H-2A visas are distributed is often subject to politics.
In the first Trump administration, we saw sort of negotiations for Guatemala to serve as what's called a third safe country for people deported from the U.S., like trading that for more H-2A worker visas that would give people an opportunity to come and work in the U.S. So the generation of these visas and the number, that are approved is part of like a larger political system. It's connected to these larger political and economic structures that bind the United States to the countries that provide this labor.
H-2A visa holders make up a minority of the people doing farm labor today. Many more are working in the U.S. without legal status.
No one has official figures, but many people estimate 40 to 50% of our farm labor force is undocumented. And that has been the case through different administrations. The vulnerability of undocumented workers has always been there.
In today's political climate, many immigrants and their advocates in Oregon are playing the waiting game. There haven't been any confirmed reports of workplace raids in the state under the new administration yet. But the fear isn't unfounded. They have happened here before. A lot of immigrant and farm worker advocacy groups are providing trainings to make sure people know their rights if anything does happen. So, to sum up a little United States history, in the late 1800s, American employers wanted to hire Japanese workers to make up for the Chinese workers that had just been banned from the country. But in the 20s, Japanese immigrants were banned from owning or leasing land. And come World War II, the Japanese farmers who established themselves in Oregon were incarcerated in camps. During both World War I and II, the U.S. wanted Mexican workers. But each war was followed by the deportation of hundreds of thousands of Mexican immigrants. And so it continues. Taken together, it all underscores a contradiction that's been playing out in the U.S. for over 100 years. Criminalizing immigrants while simultaneously relying on their labor. Remember what Lynn Stevens said?
Both simultaneously dependence on Mexican agricultural labor, but this political ideology of, law and order and detention and deportation at exactly the same time.
One thing to keep in mind, though, Oregon is what's known as a sanctuary state. It doesn't mean ICE can't arrest people here, but it does mean Oregon laws prohibit local governments, including police, from helping to enforce federal immigration laws without a judge's order. As Stephen put it,
immigrants are fundamental to who Oregon is. Not only do immigrants pick and process and prepare and sell our food, they do many, many, many other things. So I'm proud to be in Oregon, and I'm proud, that Oregon as a state is supporting immigrants and is standing firm in that support.
For former braceros like Miguel Rubio and Jesus Martinez, coming to the United States as braceros was their introduction to the country they later came to call home. For all of the program's problems, there is that. Jesus Martinez said it opened a door for him. Miguel Rubio left us with this closing note.
Y ahora, un saludo a todos aquellos braceros de nuestros tiempos, ¿verdad? Un saludo a todos que nos desanimen. De aquí les mandamos saludos si es que les llega la señal, sino a todos los que nos dedican aquí también, ¿verdad?
Now he said, I just want to send a hello to the braceros of my era, a hello to all from here, and I send my good wishes. Hopefully, they'll see them here. You can see Oregon Experience's 2007 documentary about the Bracero Program in the Pacific Northwest, featuring Miguel Rubio, Jesus Martinez, and others at opb.org. Thank you for listening to The Evergreen, a podcast from OPB. I produced this episode, and our technical director is Stephen Cray. The OPB podcast team also includes Mia Estrada, Julie Sabatier, and Sage Van Wing. Eric Kane, Michael Ben Dixon, and I did the interviews you heard. Renato Rodriguez provided translation for the Spanish language interviews. The music in this episode is from Audio Network. If you have a question for us, please reach out. Email us at theevergreen@opb.org. I'm Jen Chavez. Catch you later.